My name is Elena. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as easy to miss. Not because I'm quiet in a fragile way, but because I learned early how to take up very little emotional space. I work with numbers, systems, and long-term planning, roles where listening is valued more than speaking, and consistency matters more than visibility. From the outside, I've often been seen as dependable, reasonable, the one who doesn't make things difficult. If I'm being honest, that perception worked in everyone else's favor for a long time. People tend to underestimate me because I don't rush to defend myself. I don't raise my voice. I don't correct people in the moment when they misunderstand me. I let things land. I let silence do its work. To some, that looks like weakness. To others, it looks like compliance. Very few ever considered that it might be a choice. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, cinematic way. It's about something quieter and much more uncomfortable. It's about the long echo of words spoken casually, decisions made for the family, and how certain sentences don't end when they're said. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of being slowly written out of your own family narrative. First gently, then officially, then publicly. It's about what happens when exclusion is framed as practicality and silence is mistaken for acceptance. It's about how roles are assigned without consent and how people react when the person they underestimated stops playing along. I won't exaggerate events. I won't paint anyone as a villain or myself as a hero. There are no screaming matches here, no dramatic ultimatums, just a series of moments that, on their own, seem small and together become irreversible. This is also a story about timing, about waiting, about choosing restraint when reaction would have been easier, and about what quiet dominance actually looks like when it's rooted not in anger, but in clarity. If you've ever been the reasonable one, the one expected to understand, adjust, or step aside for the sake of peace, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. And if you've ever wondered whether silence means surrender, or whether it can become something else entirely, then I invite you to listen carefully. Before we begin, let me ask you one gentle question. Have you ever realized, too late, that a boundary you never announced was still crossed? In my family, I was never the difficult one. That distinction mattered more than anyone ever said out loud. My sister was the emotional center, brilliant, expressive, demanding in a way people found compelling. She filled rooms without trying. My parents adjusted their moods around her like furniture, shifting quietly so she wouldn't bruise herself on the edges of things. I learned early that love, in our house, flowed toward gravity. I wasn't unloved. That's important to say. I was praised often, just not for existing. I was praised for being understanding, for being low maintenance, for not needing much. I was the daughter they could rely on not to complicate things. When relatives asked about me, my parents' answers followed a familiar rhythm. She's fine. She's doing well. She's always been independent. Independent became the word that explained everything. Why didn't it get checked on as much? Why were they made without consulting me? Why was my absence never treated as an emergency? Independence, in their language, meant I would adapt. And I did. I learned how to arrive early and leave quietly. How to make myself useful without being asked. How to listen without inserting my own feelings into conversations that were already crowded. At family gatherings, I was often the one refilling glasses, helping in the kitchen, and taking coats. People smiled at me with relief, the kind reserved for someone who doesn't require attention. No one ever asked if that role was chosen. The truth is, I was easy to overlook because I made it easy. I spoke carefully, I didn't interrupt, I didn't challenge narratives that painted me as the steady one. When my sister needed support, plans shifted. When I needed space, it was assumed I already had it. There were moments, small ones, where I felt the imbalance, like when my parents would say, "You'll understand," before delivering news that affected me directly, or when my opinions were summarized instead of heard, or when my silence was treated as agreement. But nothing was ever cruel enough to confront. That's how it works, I think. True invisibility isn't imposed through force, it's negotiated through expectations. You are pressured into compliance. Thank you for your flexibility, applauded for not asking for more. I became very good at reading rooms, at noticing who mattered in each emotional equation, and I internalized, without consciously deciding to, that I was not meant to be the center of any family story. I was the supporting structure, the beam you don't see once the house is standing. From the outside, this probably looked like maturity. Inside, it felt like being permanently on standby. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being trusted but not chosen, valued for reliability, not presence. I don't think my parents realized they were doing it. They believed they were being fair. After all, I wasn't complaining, I wasn't struggling visibly, I wasn't asking for anything. So they assumed I didn't need it. I remember once, in my early 20s, a family friend said to me, "You're so easy, your parents are lucky." Everyone laughed. I smiled too, because that was the expected response. But something in me folded inward at the word easy. Not because it was untrue, but because it explained too much. Easy people are convenient, and convenience is rarely protected. By the time I reached my late 20s, my role was set. I was the daughter who would adjust her schedule, who would compromise, who would absorb disappointment quietly so others wouldn't have to. I didn't yet have language for what was happening. I just knew that when decisions were made, I was often informed last, or not at all. And when I noticed, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was strong enough not to take it personally. That's the story I believed for a long time. That who I was to them, calm, flexible, invisible, was simply who I was. I didn't yet understand that roles, once accepted, become expectations, and expectations left unchallenged become permissions. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's what makes it hard to explain now. How something so small, practical even, could leave such a precise mark. There was no argument, no raised voices, just a sentence delivered in the tone my parents used when they believed they were being reasonable. I was 27. I'd just taken a week off work to visit home after a long stretch of deadlines and overtime. It wasn't a dramatic homecoming. I didn't announce it as a big deal. I simply said I'd be there from Thursday to Monday. There was a pause on the phone, a brief one. Then my mother said gently, "This weekend might not be a good idea." I remember standing in my kitchen, barefoot, staring at the calendar on my wall. She explained that my sister had been going through a lot, that she needed space, that having too many people around would be overwhelming for her. Then came the sentence that still replays in my head, unchanged by time. "Maybe it's better if you don't come home. Your sister doesn't really want you there right now." It wasn't said unkindly. That's the part people don't understand. It was said that the way you cancel a reservation is, as if this were a logistical adjustment, not a message about belonging. I didn't know what to say, so I defaulted to my role. "Oh," I said, "okay, if that's easier." There it was, the cut, clean. Almost surgical. No one argued with me. No one reassured me that it wasn't personal. No one asked how I felt about it. The conversation moved on to grocery lists and weather, and how tired everyone was. When we hung up, I stood there longer than necessary, phone still in my hand, waiting for the reaction to arrive. Shock, maybe. Anger. Hurt. Instead, I felt something quieter. Confusion mixed with an instinctive need to justify them. I told myself they were just trying to protect my sister. I told myself I was more resilient. I told myself it wasn't rejection, it was timing, circumstances, practicality. I cancelled my trip. I emailed my manager and took the days back. I rearranged my life without making noise. When I mentioned it later to a friend, she frowned. "That's strange," she said carefully. "Did they ask you how you felt about not being welcome?" I laughed it off. "It's not like that," I said. "They just needed space." Even as I said it, I realized something unsettling. No one had asked me for space. Space had been taken from me. But the world didn't end. No dramatic fallout followed. My parents called a few days later, cheerful, talking about how much calmer the house felt. My sister never mentioned it at all. That's what made it easy to minimize. Life continued. Holidays came and went. I was invited again, eventually, as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. I started noticing how easily my presence could be negotiated away. How quickly my exclusion could be framed as care for someone else. I noticed how often the phrase, "you'll understand," appeared right before something that asked me to shrink. And the strangest part, everyone else truly seemed to forget it ever happened. At family dinners months later, someone would say, You should come by more often. And my mother would nod in agreement, as if there hadn't been a moment when my coming home was treated as a problem to solve. I didn't bring it up. I didn't want to seem sensitive. I didn't want to disrupt the image of harmony. And if I'm honest, I wasn't sure I trusted my own reaction enough to defend it. So I did what I'd always done. I remembered it quietly. That sentence, "Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there," settled somewhere deep. Not as anger, but as information. Data. A fact about how decisions were made when comfort was weighed against connection. Some wounds announce themselves immediately. Others wait. They observe. They learn where they belong. That was the first small cut. And no one noticed it but me. After the first time, it didn't feel like a crisis anymore. That's how normalization begins. Not with repetition that shocks, but with repetition that dulls. The moment something happens twice, your mind starts filing it under a pattern instead of an incident. And once it's a pattern, you start adjusting yourself around it. The next exclusion didn't involve a direct sentence. It was quieter than that. I found out through a family group chat that my parents and sister were planning a weekend away together. A short trip. Nothing elaborate. Just the three of them. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. No one had invited me. No one had mentioned it to me beforehand. There was no explanation offered, no justification attached. Just photos of a place I'd once said I wanted to visit, followed by a message from my mother. Last-minute idea. Hope work isn't too crazy for you. Hope, not a question. I typed out several responses and deleted all of them. The one that remained was the safest. Looks nice. Have a good time. That reply was rewarded with heart emojis. And that was the moment I realized something important. My cooperation made their choices feel harmless. My calm response reassured everyone that nothing was wrong, that they hadn't done anything worth revisiting. So they did it again. Plans began forming in conversations I wasn't part of. Decisions were made and shared after the fact. Sometimes I was included, sometimes I wasn't, and the criteria were never explained. When I was included, there was often an unspoken condition attached. Don't bring tension. Don't expect adjustments. Don't need anything. I told myself I was being mature, that adulthood meant not keeping score, that families weren't perfect, and this was simply how ours functioned. But beneath that reasoning was something more fragile. The belief that if I stayed agreeable, I would eventually be chosen without having to ask. I became very good at rationalizing. If I wasn't invited, I assumed they thought I was busy. If my opinion wasn't sought, I assumed they thought I wouldn't mind. If my absence wasn't noticed, I assumed it was because I was so reliable. The truth that my needs ranked lower felt too confrontational to name. There's a subtle humiliation in being excluded politely, in being left out in ways that come wrapped in concern. We didn't want to burden you. We thought you'd prefer this. You're so understanding. Each phrase positioned me as someone who wouldn't object, someone whose disappointment could be absorbed quietly without consequences. And I let it, because pushing back would have required me to become someone else. Someone who demanded clarity, someone who risked being labeled difficult. And I had spent my whole life being rewarded for the opposite. So I normalized it. I told myself the imbalance wasn't intentional, that my sister needed more support, that my parents were tired, that I was strong enough to handle less attention. What I didn't admit, even to myself, was that the cost of that strength was invisibility. I stopped expecting calls that asked how I was doing. I adjusted my excitement down before sharing news, just in case it wasn't received with enthusiasm. I learned to pre-edit my presence. When I did show up, I arrived with restraint. I didn't bring unresolved feelings into the room. I didn't reference past exclusions. I didn't ask why certain decisions were made without me. I smiled. I listened. I helped. And because I didn't object, there was no moment that required accountability. That's the danger of being reasonable in an unreasonable dynamic. You become the proof that nothing is wrong. I remember one night, lying awake after a family visit, replaying conversations in my head. Nothing overtly cruel had happened. No one had said anything unkind. And yet I felt hollow, like I'd been present without being seen. That's when I realized disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an omission, as an absence, as the quiet assumption that you will adapt again. And adaptation, repeated often enough, becomes expectation. By the time I noticed how far I'd bent, it already felt normal to stand that way. It took time for me to understand that what I was experiencing wasn't random. It was a role. Roles don't require formal agreement. They're assigned gradually, reinforced through repetition, and solidified the moment you stop questioning them. And once you inhabit one long enough, people begin to rely on it, structure their expectations around it. Mine was simple. I was the one who would adjust. In my family's internal logic, this made sense. My sister was sensitive, my parents were doing their best, and I was capable. Capable of understanding, capable of waiting, capable of being flexible, capable of absorbing disappointment without creating discomfort. I noticed how often my parents spoke about me instead of to me. Decisions involving me were framed as conclusions, not conversations. We figured you wouldn't mind. We assumed you'd be okay with it. You're so adaptable. Adaptable became another compliment that functioned like a cage. I was dependable enough not to be checked on, calm enough not to be consulted, stable enough not to be prioritized. My emotional steadiness was used as justification for my exclusion. And because I had built my identity around being rational and self-sufficient, I struggled to challenge it without feeling like I was betraying myself. Who was I, after all, if not the one who understood? The most unsettling part was how invisible the role felt to everyone else. No one sat down and said, "This is how we see you." They didn't have to. Their actions said it for them, repeatedly. When conflicts arose, I was expected to be the mediator. When plans changed, I was expected to adapt. When sacrifices were needed, mine were assumed. And I fulfilled those expectations so consistently that they stopped feeling like requests. I remember one holiday when my parents casually mentioned they'd changed the celebration date to accommodate my sister's schedule. The new date conflicted with a work commitment I'd had for months. "Oh," my mother said, almost apologetically, "but you'll figure something out. You always do." That sentence landed with more weight than she realized. I would figure something out. That was never in question. The issue was that no one considered figuring it out with me. The role of the easy one is deceptive. It comes with praise, trust, and a sense of moral high ground. You're seen as mature, reasonable, and evolved. But it also comes with erasure. Your limits are never explored because your compliance is assumed. And once that assumption is in place, your absence becomes convenient. I began to see how my family's version of harmony depended on my silence, how peace was maintained by my restraint, how balance was achieved by leaning on me without asking whether I could still hold the weight. Still, I didn't confront it, not because I didn't feel the unfairness, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I refused the role. I didn't want to be seen as selfish. I didn't want to disrupt the narrative that I was above needing reassurance. And deep down, I still hoped the role was temporary, that if I stayed patient long enough, someone would notice, that my consistency would eventually be met with consideration. But roles don't dissolve on their own. They only end when the person playing them steps off the stage. At the time, I wasn't ready to do that. I was still trying to earn visibility through reliability, still believing that being indispensable would lead to being valued. I didn't yet understand the difference. What I did understand, slowly, reluctantly, was that the version of me my family relied on required me to stay small. And the longer I stayed in that role, the harder it would be to leave without consequences. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no breaking point, no dramatic realization delivered in a moment of pain. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a place that should have felt safe, while nothing in particular was going wrong. I was sitting alone in my apartment, folding laundry, half listening to a voicemail from my mother. She was talking about logistics, an upcoming visit, a schedule adjustment, something minor. I'd heard this tone before. Careful, decisive, already settled. Then she said, almost as an aside, "We've decided it's probably best if you come a day later. Your sister will be there earlier, and it'll just be easier that way." She didn't ask if that worked for me. She didn't check my availability. She didn't acknowledge that this was another adjustment I was being expected to absorb. She said, "We've decided." I paused the voicemail mid-sentence. The laundry sat unfinished in my hands, and for the first time in years, I didn't immediately move on. I didn't rationalize. I didn't rush to understand their perspective. I didn't prepare a calm reply. I just sat there, and something in me finally registered. Not as emotion, but as clarity. This wasn't about isolated incidents. It wasn't about my sister's needs or my parents' intentions. It was about a system that functioned smoothly because I kept consenting to it without being asked. I replayed the message, listening closely to what wasn't said. No curiosity about my life, no acknowledgement of inconvenience, no sense that my presence mattered enough to negotiate for. Just an assumption that I would adjust. Again. I felt a quiet detachment settle in. Not anger, not sadness, but distance. The kind that comes when you stop trying to prove something. For the first time, I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding for years. What if nothing changes because this arrangement works perfectly for everyone but me? That question stayed with me longer than any of the words she'd spoken. I realized I had been interpreting their behavior as oversight when it was actually consistency. They weren't forgetting me, they were factoring me in, as the variable that would always accommodate. That afternoon, I didn't call back right away. Not as a statement, not as a test, just because I didn't feel the urgency anymore. I folded the rest of the laundry slowly. I made tea. I let the voicemail sit unanswered for the rest of the day. In that silence, something subtle but irreversible shifted. I stopped expecting fairness from people who benefited from the imbalance. I stopped waiting for validation that had no incentive to arrive. Instead, I started observing. I noticed how rarely my parents asked about my long-term plans, how often they assumed availability without confirming it, how my sister's preferences were framed as needs and mine as conveniences. None of this was new, but seeing it without the urge to fix it changed everything. That night, I wrote in the notebook I'd been carrying for years, usually for work notes, budgets, timelines. This time, I wrote something different. I wrote dates, phrases, decisions that had been made without me, moments when I'd been asked to adjust for the sake of ease. I wasn't building a case. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was documenting reality. There's power in naming patterns without immediately reacting to them. It removes the emotional fog. It turns experience into information. I began to understand that silence didn't have to mean compliance. It could mean evaluation. The next morning, I returned the call. My voice was calm, neutral. "That doesn't work for me," I said simply. "I'll come on the original date, or we can plan for another time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not anger, surprise. "Oh," my mother said. "Well, we'll say, oh, we'll see." We didn't resolve it at that moment, and that was fine, because the shift wasn't about the outcome of that conversation. It was about the fact that for the first time, I hadn't rearranged myself preemptively. I had interrupted the pattern. And once a pattern is interrupted, it can't go back to being invisible. After that day, I didn't announce any changes. There was no declaration, no speech about boundaries or self-respect. Outwardly, I remained the same calm, reliable presence I'd always been. I answered messages. I showed up when I said I would. I stayed polite, engaged, and reasonable. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. My silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. I stopped filling conversational gaps meant for others to address. When plans were mentioned vaguely, I didn't rush to clarify them for everyone's convenience. When assumptions were made about my availability, I waited for someone to actually ask. And when they didn't, I took that as information. This new kind of silence made people uncomfortable in small ways. Not enough to provoke confrontation, but enough to register as a change in atmosphere. My parents would pause on the phone, as if waiting for me to offer reassurance I no longer gave. My sister would glance at me during conversations, searching for the familiar nod of agreement. I wasn't withholding out of spite, I simply stopped over-functioning. And because I did it quietly, it was easy for them to misinterpret. They thought I was busy, or distracted, or going through a phase. They assumed my reduced emotional labor meant I was tired, not that I was choosing. That misunderstanding worked in my favor. I began noticing how often others rely on you to maintain equilibrium without realizing it. When you stop, even gently, the imbalance becomes visible. Small things shifted. Messages went unanswered longer. Decisions took more effort. Plans felt slightly less smooth. No one connected these changes to me. They just felt that something was off. And for the first time, I didn't rush to fix it. I also started protecting my time in ways that would have once felt selfish. I declined visits that didn't work for me, without elaborate explanations. I stopped rearranging my schedule to fit last-minute changes that benefited everyone else. Each choice was small, unremarkable. But together, they marked a quiet withdrawal from the role I'd been playing. What surprised me most was how quickly my absence was felt. Not emotionally, but logistically. Without me smoothing edges, coordinating details and adapting plans, things became slightly harder. Not disastrous, just less convenient. And inconvenience has a way of revealing where value was taken for granted. I didn't gloat. I didn't point it out. I just observed. In the notebook, I continued writing. Not complaints, but patterns. Who reached out when I didn't initiate? Who noticed when I pulled back? Who adjusted when I didn't? The answers were sobering. I also noticed something else. My calm no longer came from endurance. It came from choice. I wasn't holding myself together for the sake of family harmony. I was holding myself apart enough to see clearly. There's a misconception that silence always signals weakness. In reality, silence becomes powerful the moment it stops being a reflex, because reflexive silence protects others from discomfort. Chosen silence protects you. My parents began phrasing things differently, cautiously, as if testing new language. Would you be able to? Replaced, we assumed you would. My sister seemed unsettled by the lack of instant alignment. Still, no one addressed it directly. That's another truth I learned. People benefit from unspoken arrangements until the moment they don't. And even then, they often prefer confusion over confrontation. I didn't correct their assumptions. I didn't explain my internal shift. I let them believe whatever made sense to them. What mattered was that I no longer moved automatically. By choosing when to speak and when not to, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd given away: agency. And with agency comes leverage, not the loud kind, not the kind that threatens or demands, the quiet kind that comes from knowing you can walk away from a role without needing permission. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I wasn't planning a reveal. I was simply no longer available to be erased. And that, it turns out, was enough to change the entire dynamic, whether anyone admitted it or not. While everything on the surface appeared unchanged, something else was happening beneath it. They didn't notice because they never had reason to look. I was still polite, still present, still responsive enough not to raise alarms. From the outside, I remained the same version of myself they'd always known. The one who didn't demand, didn't escalate, didn't disrupt. But quietly, I began preparing. Not for confrontation, not for vindication, for independence, emotional, logistical, and structural, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's complete. I stopped assuming permanence. That was the first real shift. Instead of planning my life around future family events, I began planning around myself. I stopped centering decisions on hypothetical obligations that had never been reciprocated. I reviewed finances with a new lens, one that assumed I would need no one's approval or support if things changed suddenly. I updated the documents, emergency contacts, beneficiaries, medical proxies, not dramatically, methodically, the way you do when you realize stability shouldn't depend on people who don't consult you before making decisions that affect you. In my notebook, the entries became more strategic. Dates when I wasn't informed, moments when my presence was optional, patterns in who reached out and who didn't when I stopped initiating. It wasn't bitterness that drove this, it was clarity. I started noticing that I was often treated as an extra rather than an anchor. Someone nice to have, but not necessary to account for. And once I saw that, I stopped organizing my life around people who didn't factor me in. I also invested in myself in ways that had nothing to do with family approval. I pursued opportunities that required long-term commitment, ones that would make sudden availability impossible. I accepted projects that anchored me to my own priorities, instead of leaving space for last-minute adjustments, just in case. No one objected, no one even asked. They were used to me adapting. They didn't imagine a version of me who wouldn't. Emotionally, I did something even more significant. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. For years, part of my energy had gone into imagining explanations. How I would phrase my feelings gently enough. How I would justify my hurt without sounding accusatory. How I would make my needs understandable to people who had never asked for them. I let all of that go. Instead, I observed how people behave when they don't think they're being evaluated. And what I saw was consistency. My sister continued to center her comfort without acknowledging the cost. My parents continued to make decisions based on what created the least friction in the moment. No one suddenly became more considerate just because I was quieter. That, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. The preparation wasn't visible because it didn't look like defiance. It looked like maturity, like busyness, like a woman building a full life. And because it didn't threaten anyone, it went unquestioned. What they never noticed was that my silence had shifted from patience to positioning. I learned how to disengage without drama, how to reduce emotional access without cutting contact, how to be present without being available. These are skills you don't develop overnight. They require restraint, consistency, a willingness to tolerate misunderstanding. But they also create freedom. By the time subtle questions began to surface, you seemed distant. Are you okay? I already had answers that didn't require explanation. I'm good, I'd say. And it was true, because for the first time, my well-being wasn't tied to how well I fit into someone else's expectations. The irony is that they mistook my preparation for withdrawal when it was actually grounding. I wasn't leaving in anger. I was standing firmly enough not to be moved without consent. What they never noticed was that I was no longer building my life with contingency plans for people who had never planned around me. And by the time they sensed something had changed, the foundation was already set. Quietly, intentionally, permanently. The reveal wasn't a secret I uncovered about them. It was the one I uncovered about myself. It happened gradually, then all at once, the way realizations often do when you stop resisting them. I was reviewing paperwork late one evening, surrounded by neat stacks of documents I'd been organizing over the past year. Financial statements, legal forms, notes from conversations I'd once replayed in my head and now simply recorded. I wasn't emotional, I wasn't upset. I was calm. And in that calm, something became undeniable. I no longer needed them in the way they assumed I did. Not emotionally, not practically, not structurally. For most of my life, I'd been operating under an invisible contract, one I never signed but always honored. Be flexible, and you'll belong. Be easy, and you'll be included. Don't ask for too much, and you'll be kept close. That contract had expired. What I realized that night was that my leverage had never been about confrontation or withholding affection. It was about autonomy, about having a life solid enough that exclusion no longer felt like a threat. I had built that quietly, piece by piece, while everyone assumed I was simply busy. The truth was, I had options. And options change how you see everything. I no longer needed to explain myself to be understood. I no longer needed to negotiate for space in rooms where my presence was optional. I no longer needed to maintain proximity to people who only valued me when I was convenient. That realization didn't make me triumphant. It made me still. There's a particular kind of peace that arrives when you stop hoping people will become different and start accepting who they already are. I thought back to that first sentence, "Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there," how it had lodged itself into me, shaping years of quiet adjustment. And I saw it now for what it was. Not a momentary cruelty, but an early disclosure. They had told me exactly where I stood. I had just needed time and distance to believe them. The private reveal wasn't that they were wrong. It was that I was done pretending it didn't matter. I also realized something else. Equally important, clarity doesn't require announcement. I didn't need to confront them with a list of grievances. I didn't need acknowledgement to validate my experience. I didn't need an apology to move forward. I needed alignment. And alignment meant my actions would finally match what I knew to be true. That night, I closed the notebook and didn't write in it for a while. There was nothing left to document. The pattern was clear. The preparation was complete. I slept deeply, for the first time in a long while. In the weeks that followed, my decisions became simpler. Invitations were evaluated honestly, not automatically accepted. Conversations were engaged in without overinvestment. I stopped offering explanations for choices that didn't require permission. And I noticed how little resistance there was. Because people rarely push back when they believe your distance is temporary. They assume you'll come around, that this phase will pass, that the old version of you will return once things settle. That assumption was their final miscalculation. The reveal stayed private because it needed to. Power announced too early invites interference. Power held quietly reshapes outcomes without negotiation. By the time anyone realized I was no longer operating under the old rules, the rules had already changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but irrevocably. I didn't feel hardened by this understanding. I felt lighter, because the moment you stop asking to be chosen, you gain the freedom to choose yourself. And once you do that, everything else becomes optional. There comes a moment when clarity demands action. Not urgency, not a reaction, just a decision that can't be undone once it's made. I reached that moment not in a crisis, but in a quiet pause between obligations, when nothing external was forcing my hand. That's how I knew it was real. I had options, several of them. And for the first time, I evaluated those options without centering anyone else's comfort. I could continue as I was, calm, distant, loosely connected, maintain appearances, keep relationships functional but shallow. That path required the least friction and preserved the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. I could confront them directly, lay out the years of small cuts, ask for acknowledgement, fairness, and repair. That path offered the possibility of resolution, but also required emotional labor from people who had never shown interest in carrying it. Or I could choose something else entirely. I could step fully out of the role they had assigned me, without asking permission, without explanation, without burning bridges. That third option was the hardest to articulate, even to myself, because it didn't look like an action. It looked like an absence. Not disappearance, not punishment, just withdrawal of access. I considered the consequences carefully. I knew stepping back would confuse them, that they would sense loss before understanding the cause, that there would be moments of discomfort, possibly even anger, when things no longer functioned as smoothly. But I also knew something else. Staying would cost me more. Staying meant continuing to be shaped by expectations I hadn't chosen. It meant allowing my presence to be conditional. It meant reinforcing a dynamic that had already proven unwilling to change. I wasn't willing to do that anymore, so I chose the irreversible option. Not dramatic enough to feel like rebellion, but decisive enough to redefine the future. I decided to stop orienting my life around people who didn't orient around me. Practically, that meant fewer visits, longer gaps between calls, declining invitations that felt obligatory rather than mutual, not initiating conversations out of habit. Emotionally, it meant releasing the need to be understood by them. That was the most difficult part. We're taught to believe that family understanding is essential, that without it, we're incomplete or unfair. But understanding is not the same as permission, and I realized I didn't need either to move forward. I didn't announce my decision, because I didn't need validation for it. I let it show up in consistency. When I said no, I meant it. When I said maybe, I evaluated honestly. When I said yes, it was because I wanted to be there, not because I felt obligated. Over time, that consistency became impossible to ignore. The dynamic shifted, not explosively but undeniably. My parents began asking more questions, tentatively, cautiously. My sister seemed unsettled by my reduced availability, unsure how to position herself without my quiet alignment. Still, no one named it, and I didn't either, because the decision point wasn't about being seen, it was about being free. There's a particular kind of strength in choosing the path that doesn't require anyone else to change in order for you to be okay. It removes negotiation from the equation. I didn't walk away from my family in anger. I walked toward myself with clarity, and once that direction was set, there was no returning to the version of me who stayed silent out of hope rather than choice. That version of me had done her best. This one was doing something different. Once the decision was made, everything that followed felt almost quiet. Not empty, not lonely, just calm in a way I hadn't experienced before. The kind of calm that comes when your actions finally align with your understanding. I didn't make sweeping changes overnight. I moved deliberately, the way you do when you know you won't be returning to a previous arrangement. I stopped treating family plans as fixed points in my calendar. I began scheduling my life without leaving margins just in case. If something conflicted, I chose what supported the life I was building, not the expectations I'd outgrown. When invitations came, I paused before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for myself. I asked one simple question internally: do I want this, or do I feel required? The answer became my guide. Legally and financially, I continued what I'd started months earlier. I finalized documents, simplified accounts, ensured that my future wasn't entangled in assumptions about family proximity or obligation. None of this was reactive. It was preventative. I was building a structure that didn't depend on emotional reciprocity, which had never been reliable. No one noticed these changes because they didn't disrupt anyone else's routine. From the outside, I still appeared stable, successful, and composed. If anything, I seemed more settled. That's the paradox of moving in silence. It often looks like nothing is happening at all. Conversations with my parents became shorter, more neutral. I didn't volunteer updates unless asked. I didn't fill pauses with reassurance. When they expressed mild concern, "You've been busy lately," I acknowledged it without elaboration. "Yes," I'd say, "I have." And that was true. My sister reached out less frequently. When she did, the conversations felt different, more transactional, less assumed. Without my automatic support, she seemed unsure how to engage. Still, no one confronted me. People often sense loss before they're willing to name it. And loss without a clear explanation is deeply unsettling. I watched as small inconveniences began to surface. Plans required more coordination. Emotional labor went unperformed. The family rhythm lost its quiet buffer. They didn't attribute this to me consciously, but they felt it. Meanwhile, my life expanded in ways that felt grounded rather than compensatory. I invested in relationships that were reciprocal. I built routines that didn't require me to be on standby. I made choices without rehearsing how they would be received. There was relief in that. The most significant shift, though, was internal. I no longer felt the urge to explain myself preemptively. I didn't fear being misunderstood because I wasn't asking to be understood. Silence, once a defense mechanism, had become a strategy. And strategy doesn't announce itself. There's a misconception that power must be visible to be real. In truth, the most durable power operates quietly, reshaping outcomes before anyone realizes the game has changed. By the time my absence was noticed, not as presence, but as function, it was too late to reinsert me into the old role without my consent. I had stepped out of it completely. And because I hadn't made a noise doing so, no one had the opportunity to stop me. That's the thing about silence when it's chosen. It creates space not just for withdrawal, but for redirection. I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning. The consequences didn't arrive as an explosion. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle, so subtle that no one named it outright. A missed detail here, a plan that felt harder to coordinate there. Conversations that stalled without the familiar sense of flow. Things that had once worked smoothly now required effort. And effort, when people aren't used to exerting it, feels like a loss. My parents were the first to sense it, though they couldn't articulate what exactly had changed. Phone calls became slightly more frequent, but also more tentative. There were pauses where there hadn't been before, questions framed carefully, as if they were searching for a tone they no longer recognized. "You seem farther away," my mother said once, not accusingly, more puzzled than anything. I didn't rush to reassure her. "I'm okay," I replied, and again it was true. What she meant, but didn't say, was that they felt the distance. Because without my quiet adjustments, the system they were used to began showing its strain. Holidays required more negotiation. Schedules clashed. Emotional labor went unassigned. The absence of my automatic flexibility created friction that they weren't accustomed to managing. Still, no one connected this friction to years of expectation. They experienced the effect without examining the cause. My sister reacted differently. Her messages carried a new edge, subtle irritation masked as casual remarks. "You've changed," she said once, half joking, half testing. I let the comment sit. Change unsettles people most when it removes something they relied on without realizing it. She had grown used to my presence as background support. Reliable, quiet, unquestioning. Without it, she had to sit more directly with our parents' attention, their expectations, and their emotional needs. That shift wasn't comfortable. What fascinated me was how quickly concern turned into inconvenience. The questions weren't about how I felt. They were about why things felt harder now. Why did coordination take longer? Why do emotional atmospheres feel heavier? Loss to them wasn't my absence. It was the disappearance of ease. And that told me everything. I remained calm through all of it. Not distant, not cold, just steady. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I didn't remind anyone of past moments. I didn't say, "This is what it felt like for me." Because this wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about letting reality speak for itself. The consequences weren't punitive. They were natural. When someone stops compensating for an imbalance, the imbalance becomes visible. That visibility was uncomfortable, but necessary. My parents began reaching out with offers instead of assumptions. "Would this work for you?" replaced, "We figured you could." The shift was tentative, unsure, as if they were testing unfamiliar ground. But even then, something had changed permanently. Because these adjustments weren't coming from understanding, they were coming from necessity. And necessity doesn't undo history. I noticed how quickly regret can surface when people feel loss, but how slowly accountability follows. It's easier to miss what someone provided than to acknowledge why they stopped. I didn't resent them for that. I simply observed. There was a strange peace in watching consequences unfold without needing to manage them. For the first time, I wasn't responsible for smoothing over discomfort that wasn't mine to fix. That responsibility had never been assigned explicitly. I had just always picked it up, and now I didn't. The family dynamic didn't collapse. It recalibrated, awkwardly, imperfectly. And in that recalibration, my position was no longer assumed. It was uncertain, which was exactly as it should have been. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were already behind it. Not behind in the sense of timing, but behind in understanding. The first real sign of panic came disguised as concern. A longer phone call, a softer tone, questions that circled instead of landing. "Did we do something?" my father asked one evening. It wasn't accusatory. It was tentative, almost cautious, as if he were approaching a fragile object he didn't know how to handle. I considered my answer carefully. "No," I said, not recently. That was the truth. Nothing new had happened, nothing dramatic, nothing they could point to and repair with a conversation or a gesture. That's the part people struggle with the most. They want a moment to fix, a misunderstanding to clarify, a sentence they can apologize for and move past. But what if the damage wasn't a moment? What if it was a pattern? They began reaching out more frequently after that, checking in, offering help I didn't need, suggesting visits with an unfamiliar urgency, as if proximity alone could reset what had shifted. It couldn't, because by the time they noticed the distance, I had already reorganized my life around it. They were responding to absence. I had moved on from expectation. My mother tried next. She framed it emotionally. Softly, almost carefully. "I feel like you don't need us anymore," she said. There it was. "Do you feel excluded? Did we hurt you? But we feel unnecessary." I didn't correct her, because what she was feeling wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. I did need them less. Not because I didn't love them, but because I had learned not to rely on people who didn't consider me in their decisions. That lesson had taken years. It wasn't undone by concern expressed too late. They suggested talking things through, clearing the air, starting fresh. I listened. I acknowledged the effort, and still I didn't agree. Not out of stubbornness, out of realism. There was nothing to clear that hadn't already been revealed through behavior. And starting fresh requires mutual recognition of what went wrong, not just discomfort with the outcome. What they wanted was relief. What I needed was alignment. Those two things weren't the same.
I could see their confusion deepening, how the old assumptions no longer worked, how their attempts to restore closeness felt strangely ineffective.
They didn't understand that the version of me they were reaching for no longer existed. She was the one who adjusted quietly, who filled gaps without being asked, who accepted exclusion as practicality. She had carried the relationship on her back for a long time, and she was tired. I wasn't angry with them. That's what made it hardest to explain. Anger would have given them something to push against, something to argue with. But clarity doesn't negotiate. I told them calmly that I was happy with the life I had built, that I valued peace, that I wasn't interested in reopening old dynamics. They heard rejection. What I meant was completion. There's a point where repair isn't about effort, it's about timing. And timing, once missed, doesn't reset. They were trying to fix the outcome without acknowledging the cost that preceded it. And I no longer needed the fix. That's when they realized something else. Too late. The power to define the relationship had shifted. Not through confrontation, not through leverage, through withdrawal. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't closing doors dramatically. I had simply stopped holding one open indefinitely. And once a door closes quietly, without argument, it doesn't slam back open just because someone notices the silence. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like what people imagined. There were no raised voices, no tears, no dramatic recounting of grievances. It took place at a small cafe near my apartment, chosen for its neutrality more than its comfort. Public enough to keep things measured, quiet enough to allow honesty. My parents sat across from me, their posture careful, as if they were afraid a wrong word might push me further away. That alone told me how unfamiliar this position was for them. They were used to my accommodation, not my stillness. My mother spoke first. "We just want to understand," she said. "You feel so different, distant." I nodded. "Not in agreement, just acknowledgement." "I am different," I said, "but not in the way you think." They waited. That silence, their waiting, was new. I didn't list examples. I didn't bring up dates or repeat sentences they'd said years ago. I didn't need to. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a closing conversation. "I spent a long time adjusting myself to make things easier," I continued. "I thought that was what being understanding meant." My father frowned slightly. "We never asked you to do that." "I know. That's the point." They exchanged a look. Confusion, maybe a hint of defensiveness, but I didn't press. "I stopped," I said simply. "That's the change." There was a pause, not a tense one, just space settling into place. My mother asked carefully, "Did we hurt you?" I considered the question, not because it was hard to answer, but because it deserved precision. "Yes," I said, "but not in a way that can be fixed by an apology." That landed. I explained, not emotionally, not accusingly, that the hurt wasn't about one decision or one sentence. It was about years of being treated as flexible instead of essential, about being excluded politely, about having my presence negotiated away without conversation. They listened. Truly listened. I could tell because they didn't interrupt. When I finished, my father said quietly, "We didn't realize." "I believe that," I replied. "And that's part of why this can't go back to what it was." I wasn't asking for them to feel guilty. I wasn't trying to make them uncomfortable. I was stating a boundary, one that didn't require their agreement to exist. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm not cutting anyone off. I just don't want to go back to being the person who adapts without being considered." They nodded, slowly. "What does that mean for us?" my mother asked. It was the most honest question she'd asked me in years. "It means," I said, "that our relationship will be built on what's mutual, not assumed." There was no argument. No attempt to negotiate terms, just acceptance, uneven, uncertain, but real. We finished our coffee. We stood. We hugged. The hug was careful, different, less familiar, more respectful. As I walked away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. Confrontation doesn't need heat to be effective. Sometimes clarity, delivered calmly, is enough to end a chapter. I didn't leave with promises. I left with alignment. And that was enough. I am not who I was when this story began. That doesn't mean I'm hardened. It doesn't mean I've become distant in the way people fear. It means my sense of self no longer depends on being agreeable to feel secure. I used to think strength was endurance, that maturity meant absorbing discomfort quietly so others wouldn't have to. That love was proven through flexibility. I know better now. Strength is discernment. It's knowing when understanding becomes self-erasure. It's recognizing when silence is no longer peace, but permission. The version of me who stayed quiet for so long wasn't weak. She was doing the best she could with the tools she had. She believed that if she stayed reasonable, she would be valued. That if she didn't ask for much, she would be kept close. She deserved compassion, not correction, but she also deserved relief. Today, my life is quieter, but fuller. My relationships are fewer, but reciprocal. I no longer perform emotional labor by default. I don't fill gaps that aren't mine to fill. I don't explain my boundaries as if they're negotiable. And I don't feel guilty about that. My relationship with my parents exists, but it's different, more measured, more intentional. There is less assumption and more asking. Less familiarity, more suspicion. It isn't perfect, but it's honest. My sister and I are cordial, not close. That used to feel like a failure. Now it feels accurate. Proximity without alignment isn't intimacy, it's habit. I've learned that not every relationship is meant to be repaired into closeness. Some are meant to be recalibrated into truth. I don't carry bitterness toward them. Bitterness requires attachment to an outcome that didn't happen. I've released that. What I carry instead is clarity. I know who I am when no one is watching. I know what I need to feel grounded. I know that my worth doesn't increase when I'm convenient, and it doesn't disappear when I'm not. That knowledge has changed how I move through the world. I speak less, but with intention. I choose presence instead of availability. I allow people to feel the consequences of their expectations without rushing to soften them. And perhaps most importantly, I trust myself now. I trust my perception. I trust my timing. I trust that walking away quietly can be an act of self-respect, not abandonment. Some people still misunderstand me. They see distance and assume coldness. They interpret boundaries as punishment. I no longer rush to correct them. Being misunderstood is no longer more painful than being diminished. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to explain yourself to be valid. And you don't need permission to stop playing a role that costs you your sense of self. I didn't win anything by stepping back. I reclaimed something, and that has made all the difference. There's a lesson in this story that took me years to understand, and even longer to accept. It's not that people are intentionally unkind. It's those systems that form around what goes unchallenged. Roles solidify around who absorbs the most without complaint. And over time, what begins as consideration quietly turns into expectation. Some words hurt once, others follow you for a lifetime. Not because they're repeated, but because they explain something you've been trying not to see. When my parents said, "Don't come home, your sister doesn't want you there," it wasn't just a sentence about timing. It was a summary of where I stood when comfort was prioritized over connection. Years later, when a version of that sentence resurfaced at my wedding, again framed as practicality, again delivered calmly, it wasn't shocking. It was consistent. What changed wasn't them. It was me. I stopped interpreting exclusion as circumstance and started recognizing it as information. I stopped asking myself how to adapt and started asking whether I should. I stopped equating silence with maturity and realized that silence, when unchosen, is just another way of disappearing. This story doesn't end with reconciliation or punishment. It ends with alignment. Not everyone who loses access to you will understand why. Some will feel confused, some will feel wronged, some will believe you changed for no reason at all. That's the cost of choosing yourself quietly. And it's a cost worth paying, because when you stop carrying relationships alone, you discover which ones were never meant to be mutual and which ones survive only when they are. If you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't owe endless understanding to people who never tried to understand you. You don't have to announce your boundaries for them to be real, and you don't need to make a scene to leave a role that's been shrinking you for years. Walking away doesn't always look like leaving. Sometimes it looks like it's no longer stepping forward. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't erase my past. I didn't rewrite my family story. I simply stopped editing myself to fit into it. And that choice, made quietly, consistently, and without apology, gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Peace. Before I go, I want to ask you something, especially if this story felt familiar. Have you ever been praised for being easy or understanding, only to realize later that it cost you visibility? If so, I'd like to hear your story.